talking about here on my channel right now. It's all about Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively's.
It has now reached a point where every headline looks like a grenade thrown into the middle of an already burning battlefield. And the name echoing louder than most is Isabella Farah. Once a minor presence in the sprawling saga of Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni, but now thrust into the center of speculation because of a single court filing that looked ordinary on its face, yet turned into the sharpest card Justin has played, a move that doesn't just protect him, but actively threatens to erase Isabella from Blake's carefully crafted narrative, a move so calculated that it forces everyone to ask why Blake Lively is fighting so aggressively to keep Isabella in play, and why Isabella's own lawyer suddenly began playing hardball after months of quiet compliance. Because the truth is simple. This isn't about subpoenas being harassment, since Blake subpoenaed Isabella first without anyone calling it harassment. Yet when Justin did the same, it was painted as predatory, and the hypocrisy is. What has people shaking their heads, saying make it make sense? Because Farah isn't Waldo hiding in a children's puzzle book. She's a real person entangled in one of Hollywood's most intense legal dramas. Someone who was only physically on set for 4 days, but later folded into Blake's after-movie strategies. And so the finger-pointing should not be toward Baldoni for trying to reach her, but toward Blake for pulling her in so deeply. Because if Isabella doesn't have first-hand knowledge of wrongdoing, then the honest answer is, I don't know. But instead of taking that neutral position, she has allowed herself to become a pawn caught between two powerful sides. A pawn now costing herself thousands in legal fees and shredding her own reputation by letting her lawyer issue statements that read like press releases to publicly humiliate Baldoni. And that is why people say shame on you, Isabella Farah, for choosing silence in the middle while allowing the press to weaponize your name against a man who may be guilty of nothing more than trying to defend himself. The filing itself hit like a grenade because while most papers in a legal war amount to little more than routine scheduling or discovery disputes, this one shifted Isabella from background witness to potential key holder. And that transformation, buried in dry text, was exactly the kind of trap veteran litigators recognize, the kind of technicality that has toppled entire celebrity lawsuits before. And in that sense, Justin's lawyers looked almost gleeful because they had turned Blake's hidden connection into their own weapon, daring the court and the public to ask why Isabella was so central if Blake had nothing to hide. Because the real sting isn't what the paper said, but what it implied. That Isabella carries a secret capable of changing the trajectory of the whole case. And this implication didn't materialize out of thin air, but traces back to February when Blake herself went for the jugular and issued a subpoena directly to Isabella, raising the obvious question of why out of dozens of names she could have chosen, she zeroed in on Farah at that exact moment. And the timeline only thickens the mystery, because Isabella's lawyer Michael Mann initially accepted the subpoena without fuss, treating it like routine. Yet months later the brakes screeched. Compliance turned into resistance, and suddenly every minor discovery request morphed into prolonged disputes that bled time and ballooned costs, a tactic that smelled less like truth-seeking and more like delay for pay. Strategy, with Michael Mann focusing obsessively on indemnification and fees rather than substance, essentially making process itself the battlefield, which only feeds speculation that the documents requested were never trivial but highly specific, chosen to connect dots that Blake didn't want anyone to connect, communications or exchanges that might prove Isabella wasn't just a passive actress, but an active thread linking back to Blake in ways that could undermine her claims. That's why July became pivotal, because Wayfarer Studios, backing Baldoni, issued their own subpoena to Isabella for documents they suspected Blake's team either never asked for or never turned over. And though the rules of discovery demand sharing, suspicions mount that Blake cherry-picked what to reveal, sending over sanitized pieces that painted her sympathetically while leaving in the dark anything that could weaken her story. And gossip suggests that some of those hidden materials may have slipped through channels anyway, finding their way back to Baldoni's side, which would explain his camp's confidence. Because in Hollywood legal wars, discovery battles are often bloodier than trials, and nothing ignites scandal faster than the idea that one party is hiding evidence. Against this backdrop, Isabella's sudden refusal to cooperate looks less like fear of harassment and more like fear of betraying the side she's aligned with, namely Blake and Ryan Reynolds, whose influence in Hollywood is immense, making it career suicide for a young actress to openly contradict them. And that is why Isabella floats in this middle space, unwilling to speak against Baldoni because she knows he has evidence of her earlier praise, texts and statements where she thanked him for, creating a safe set, but also unwilling to contradict Blake because that would risk being exiled from one of the most powerful celebrity circles in the business, leaving her paralyzed, dragged into court filings yet unable to fully pick a lane, which in turn forces everyone else to pick for her, painting her as a reluctant villain who, by hiding behind her lawyer's obstruction, becomes complicit in the smear against Baldoni. And this is where Justin's team executed their sharpest reverse card, because instead of attacking Isabella directly, they framed the issue as her lawyer manufacturing obstacles that only drive up her costs unnecessarily, pointing out that had Michael Mann simply accepted service like he did for Blake's subpoena months earlier, this entire skirmish would have been avoided. But now his refusal raises the obvious suspicion. What are they trying so hard to keep buried? Because if Isabella truly had nothing to say, a deposition would be a quick, uneventful procedure where she could simply answer, "I don't know," to most questions, and the matter would move on. But resisting discovery so aggressively signals the opposite.
Crack addict from Boston, played an Upper East Side princess.
That she does know something, or at the very least that Blake believes she does, which is why she was subpoenaed in the first place. Add to that the hypocrisy in media framing, where Baldoni subpoenaing Isabella is painted as harassment, but Blake subpoenaing her is painted as due diligence, and the double standard becomes impossible to ignore, fueling outrage from commentators who ask why Isabella is being allowed to sit in the middle while Justin's name is smeared across headlines. Because unless Isabella herself says he wronged her on set, then the narrative that he harassed another co-star is pure insinuation, built not on her testimony but on silence and leaks, and silence in this context becomes complicity, which is why critics now direct their anger at her, saying shame on you for letting your name be used as a weapon without ever speaking the truth. The broader irony is that Isabella herself once expressed gratitude after filming, praising Baldoni for creating a comfortable, safe environment, words that now stand in stark contradiction to the narrative being spun around her. And unless she disavows those words, the public has reason to doubt the insinuations, which is why Justin's attorneys strategically highlighted them in their response, reminding the court that Farah herself once endorsed his conduct, a move that undercuts her credibility should she later try to pivot. Meanwhile, her lawyer's fixation on indemnification only makes matters worse, because by arguing that Wayfarer should cover her costs due to contractual obligations, he inadvertently signals that her resistance isn't about principle but about money, turning her into someone fighting to protect fees rather than truth, a portrayal that makes it easier for Baldoni's camp to cast her as a reluctant pawn hiding behind billing disputes. And so the case now spirals around her, with both sides framing her as pivotal while she herself avoids taking the stand. But the longer she delays, the harsher the spotlight burns, because Hollywood thrives on narratives of betrayal and hidden truths, and Isabella's role, however small it began, has mutated into that of a potential whistleblower or a silent accomplice. Either way, her name is no longer background noise. It is etched into filings that read like traps, filings that Justin's team are using not just to protect themselves, but to flip the script entirely, turning Blake's secret weapon into a liability, and in doing so exposing the fragility of the narrative Blake has been building for months. In this sense, the real story isn't just about subpoenas or motions, but about strategy, about how a single witness, reluctant and cornered, can become the lever that tips the scales, and whether Isabella wants it or not. She is that lever, and every delay, every evasive motion, every press-fueled whisper only tightens the grip until eventually she must decide. Remain silent and let her reputation sink with Blake's crumbling strategy, or speak openly and risk alienating the powerful circle that pulled her into this in the first place, because in the end, the cost of silence may prove far greater than the cost of truth. The delays only made people more suspicious, because in legal battles time itself becomes a weapon, and every week of resistance looked less like principle and more like calculation, which is why whispers in the legal circle quickly shifted from sympathy to skepticism, with gossip openly suggesting that Isabella Farah's refusal to comply wasn't about protecting her rights, but about buying time, plain and simple, because the longer she remained tied up in paperwork limbo, the safer Blake lively looked. The longer Justin Baldoni was forced to burn resources, chasing her the less likely damaging testimony would surface. And once you frame it that way, the pattern suddenly looks rehearsed rather than accidental. A shield designed to stall discovery and drain energy until the cracks Blake feared could be patched or hidden. Which is exactly why eyebrows shot up when Michaelman, her lawyer, dug in with a level of resistance disproportionate to the relatively routine requests on the table, transforming what should have been a few ordinary document turnovers and a deposition into a drawn-out mini-war that ballooned fees and wasted months. And so the refusal no longer looked like a bland legal maneuver, but a strategic shield aimed at keeping whatever Farah truly knows sealed, because every blocked subpoena, every dragged-out fight only deepened one suspicion. Farah isn't a bystander here. She isn't a disposable extra, and if she were truly irrelevant, there wouldn't be this level of effort to keep her walled off, which is why Justin's lawyers eventually stopped playing the slow game, realizing fair play wasn't going to cut it anymore, and flipping the entire strategy on its head. Because in law, sometimes the sharpest move isn't extracting testimony, but erasing it, not by defeating a witness on the stand, but by removing the witness from the case altogether. And that's the curveball Baldoni's team just threw, a reverse Uno card that no one saw coming, because instead of continuing the chase for Isabella's words, they offered a stipulation. Let's cut her out entirely. No documents, no deposition, no testimony, not a whisper of her communications, nothing to fuel Blake's narrative, a proposal that stunned insiders because for months Farah had been painted as central, the secret weapon both sides seemed to orbit, and then suddenly one side declared she should vanish, and this instantly raised the biggest question of all. Why would Baldoni's camp erase her unless they believed she held something unpredictable, maybe even dangerous, a piece of testimony that could backfire in ways too risky to gamble with? At first glance it looked like dodging, but at a deeper level it was tactical brilliance, like removing the most threatening chess piece not by capture, but by agreement that it simply won't be allowed on the board, a way of protecting your king without ever acknowledging how sharp the threat actually was. Because by reframing the battle they positioned Isabella not as a silenced victim, but as clutter, an unnecessary obstacle preventing the trial from sticking to the heart of the real issues. Which is a subtle but powerful shift in narrative, because perception is half the game. And while headlines scream Baldoni cuts key witness, rather than Baldoni ensures fairness, inside the courtroom the stipulation neutralizes Blake's supposed ace, leaving her boxed in. Either fight to keep Isabella alive and risk unpredictable testimony that could crumble under cross-examination, or accept her erasure and weaken her own argument by losing the witness she worked so hard to subpoena back in February, and either way the control tilts back to Justin's camp. But the brilliance of the move is shadowed by the danger of perception, because to the public optics can feel like verdicts, and people already trained by gossip outlets latch onto the simplest angle. So while lawyers debate discovery rules, fans scrolling through headlines are left thinking Baldoni must have something to hide if he's trying to sidestep a witness, even though the actual stipulation says the opposite, that neither side can use her, meaning no weapon for Blake, no liability for Justin, just a clean trial. But perception rarely reads the fine print. And this is where Judge Lyman looms as the wild card, because while he technically controls what's allowed on record, his history of rulings has swung both ways, sometimes rigidly procedural, other times surprisingly flexible, and that unpredictability leaves both camps on edge. Because if he approves the stipulation, Isabella's name vanishes from the trial. Completely, no documents, no testimony, her thread cut from the record. But if he rejects it, she re-enters with more weight than ever, because the mere attempt to erase her will frame her as urgent, a witness too important to sideline. And so either outcome reshapes the trial dramatically. But meanwhile, reputations are already taking hits outside the courtroom where gossip outruns rulings, and headlines spin harassment narratives long before any evidence is confirmed, painting Baldoni as a harasser for issuing a subpoena even though Blake did the same first. And that's the double standard fueling outrage, because by any rational measure both sides have the right to issue subpoenas, but only one gets vilified, and the reason ties back to power and perception, because Blake's team knows how to weaponize optics, flooding the field with insinuations while quietly issuing over 100 subpoenas themselves, even stretching toward content creators online, a strategy critics say is harassment in another form, because it aims not just to gather evidence but to silence voices and control the narrative itself. And it's telling that even media veterans like Harvey Levin of TMZ have openly warned both sides not to drag him into their war, reminding them he has dirt on each if they push too far, which underscores that in Hollywood legal showdowns, discovery battles aren't just about evidence, but about who controls the megaphone of conversation, because the trial itself is only half the arena. The other half is fought in gossip outlets, fan feeds, and viral headlines that cement reputations before verdicts arrive. And that is why Baldoni's move to stipulate away Farah isn't just legal maneuvering. It's narrative jujitsu, reframing her not as a victim silenced, but as a relevant noise, and in doing so forcing Blake into a lose-lose. Because either she keeps fighting to use Isabella and risks unpredictable testimony, or she agrees to cut her loose and loses the leverage she fought so hard to keep. But in either case, the spotlight on Isabella intensifies, because the very act of trying to erase her makes her feel central.
Crack addict from Boston, played an Upper East Side princess.
And now everyone wonders what she truly knows that made both sides treat her as nuclear. And this is where the tragedy for Isabella lies, because silence has turned her into an enigma, and in Hollywood enigmas get written over by gossip. So whether she wants it or not, she is now the lever that could tip the case, the pawn who became the piece everyone debates. And by allowing her lawyer to drag things out, she only deepens suspicions that she holds a truth sharp enough to cut, which means that even if the judge grants the stipulation, even if her name never appears in the trial record, the headlines will keep circling her, the whispers will keep pointing to her, and the suspicion will remain that Blake subpoenaed her for a reason and Justin fought to erase her for a reason, leaving Isabella trapped as both ghost and grenade in a battle where the court decides procedure but Hollywood decides reputation. And in that larger war, perception already feels settled, because gossip never needs footnotes. It thrives on implications. And by the time filings are explained, nobody is reading the clarifications, which means Baldoni's gamble may save him in court, but the court of public opinion will keep echoing her name, and Blake's gamble of flooding subpoenas may give her discovery leverage, but will also tarnish her image as overreaching. And through it all, the judge's gavel may close the record, but it cannot silence the conversation. Because at this point it is clear the real fight is not just legal but cultural, a fight over who controls the Hollywood narrative. And Isabella Farah, whether she likes it or not, has become the centerpiece of that fight, the silent witness who by speaking nothing says everything, and every delay, every refusal, every headline only cements her role further, until eventually she must decide whether to stay silent and let her reputation sink with Blake's or speak and risk exile from the powerful circle that pulled her in. Because in this game, the cost of silence may prove higher than the cost of truth, and that is the paradox Baldoni's reverse Uno move exposes with brutal clarity. Sometimes the smartest way to win isn't to play the piece at all, but to take it off the board before it moves, leaving everyone to argue not about what was said, but about what was never allowed to be said. And that silence, amplified by gossip, becomes the loudest testimony of all. Thanks for watching. Subscribe my channel for more updates.